Leave. Right now. Richard Ashford's voice cracked across the packed school auditorium like a judge delivering a final sentence. Every conversation died. Hundreds of heads turned toward the lone black girl standing beside the stage, her worn backpack hanging from one shoulder, her fingers still wrapped around a blue presentation folder. The bright stage lights reflected off the polished hardwood floor, making every step toward the exit feel impossible to hide. A few students exchanged uneasy glances. Others lowered their eyes. No one dared challenge the billionaire whose name was engraved on the new science building outside. Ava Brooks did not move. Her breathing remained slow, but the tight grip on the folder betrayed the storm inside her. Richard took one deliberate step closer, the expensive leather soles of his shoes clicking sharply through the heavy silence. "Did you not hear me?" he asked, his voice calm now, somehow colder than before. "You interrupted my son's award ceremony. You are done here." Ethan Ashford stood beside the championship trophy with a rehearsed smile frozen across his face, though the corners of his mouth twitched ever so slightly. The applause that had filled the room only seconds earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by the soft mechanical hum of the ceiling projectors and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. Ava finally lifted her eyes. She did not look at Richard first. She looked at Ethan. His gaze darted away almost instantly. Just for a heartbeat. But she noticed. So did someone else. Principal Daniel Cooper tightened his jaw behind the podium, one hand resting on a sealed envelope that had arrived less than 10 minutes earlier. He had not opened it. Not yet. Richard mistook the silence for surrender. "Security," he called without raising his voice. "Escort Miss Brooks outside before she ruins another student's achievement." A uniformed campus officer hesitated near the aisle. His boots remained planted against the polished floor. Students began whispering. The sound spread row by row like wind moving through dry leaves. "That is Ava. She won the state research competition. Why would she interrupt unless—" The whispers stopped the moment Richard slowly turned his head toward the audience. His reputation alone was enough to silence an entire room. Ava inhaled carefully. Her voice, when it came, barely rose above a whisper. "I never came to embarrass your son." Richard folded his arms. "Then explain why you stood up in front of everyone." Ava looked once more at Ethan, whose face had lost every trace of color beneath the stage lights. "Because the project everyone is celebrating." She stopped herself. Richard laughed once, short and dismissive. "Enough. Nobody wants excuses." Ava lowered her eyes again. The blue folder remained pressed against her chest. The edge of a printed photograph peeked from inside, unnoticed by almost everyone in the auditorium. Almost. Principal Cooper saw it. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The envelope beneath his hand suddenly felt much heavier. Somewhere backstage, a laptop emitted a soft notification chime. One teacher frowned and checked her tablet. Another looked toward the control booth above the auditorium. Richard stretched out his arm and pointed toward the exit again. "Last chance." Ava nodded slowly. Without another word, she turned toward the aisle. The sound of her sneakers echoed through the silent auditorium as every pair of eyes followed her. Then, just before she reached the doors, every projector in the room suddenly went black. A single system alert flashed across the massive screen above the stage. Someone had just accessed the original submission files. The glowing screen washed the auditorium in a cold blue haze, stealing every ounce of confidence from Richard Ashford's face. His arm remained frozen in the air, still pointing toward the exit, but nobody looked at Ava anymore. Every eye was locked on the giant display above the stage. A loading bar crept forward one painful inch at a time. The ceiling vents whispered overhead. Somewhere near the back row, a dropped program fluttered across the polished floor. Principal Daniel Cooper slowly stepped away from the podium, his dress shoes tapping against the hardwood with measured precision. "Who authorized access to the archive?" he asked. No one answered. Ethan's breathing became uneven. Tiny beads of sweat gathered along his hairline despite the cool air pouring from the vents. He tugged at the collar of his blazer, as though it had suddenly become 2 sizes too small. Richard noticed. "Relax," he muttered under his breath. "It is probably a technical mistake." Ethan did not reply. Ava stood alone beside the auditorium doors, one hand still resting on the metal push bar. She could leave. She knew she should. Yet something deep inside refused to let the truth walk away with her. The screen chimed softly. File history restored. A timestamp appeared. Then another. Hundreds of students leaned forward in perfect silence. Every saved version of the science project lined up across the display like footprints leading back through time. Richard frowned. "This proves nothing." Principal Cooper narrowed his eyes. "Keep scrolling." The technology coordinator in the control booth swallowed hard before pressing another key. The room filled with the faint clicking of a keyboard and the steady hum of the projector fan. New timestamps appeared. Different usernames. Different edits. Ethan stared at the screen as if willing it to stop. His fingers curled so tightly around his award plaque that his knuckles turned white. Richard finally looked at his son instead of Ava. "Tell me this is a mistake." Ethan swallowed. "Dad, tell me." The single word landed heavier than a shout. Ethan opened his mouth but no sound came out. Across the front row, a science teacher slowly raised her hand. "Those timestamps are impossible to fake." Another teacher nodded. "They go back almost 8 months. Murmurs spread through the audience again, louder this time. Ava remained motionless. Her shoulders were tense, but there was no satisfaction on her face. Only exhaustion. She had spent countless evenings alone in the school laboratory, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of solder and machine oil lingering in the air while everyone else went home. She remembered cleaning fingerprints off microscope lenses because she could not afford to damage borrowed equipment. She remembered sleeping 4 hours a night while working weekends in the library with her mother. Every late night suddenly felt visible. Richard's jaw tightened. Even if she worked on it, Ethan could still have. He stopped. Another document opened automatically. Original draft. Author, Ava Brooks. Gasps rolled through the auditorium. Then another file appeared. Revision requested by faculty advisor. Author, Ava Brooks. Then another. Video recording available. Principal Cooper's expression changed completely. He looked toward Ava with something closer to regret than surprise. Richard's confidence cracked for the first time all afternoon. "Who uploaded these?" he demanded. The technology coordinator looked down at his monitor, confusion spreading across his face. "I did not. Someone with administrator clearance released every locked file exactly 30 seconds ago." Richard turned sharply toward the control booth. "Who has that level of access?" Before anyone could answer, the side door near the stage opened with a quiet metallic click. Slow footsteps echoed through the silent auditorium. Every head turned toward the hallway as an elderly woman carrying a weathered leather briefcase stepped into the light. Principal Cooper's eyes widened. He whispered only 3 words. "The school trustee." The trustee did not rush. Her polished cane tapped softly against the hardwood, each step echoing through the frozen auditorium until even the projector seemed quieter. Silver light shimmered across the brass clasp of her weathered briefcase as dozens of students instinctively raised their phones. Tiny camera shutters clicked one after another. Richard Ashford straightened his jacket, forcing a confident smile back onto his face. "Margaret," he said evenly. "I was just resolving an unfortunate disruption." The elderly woman did not answer him. Her sharp gray eyes drifted past the billionaire and settled on Ava Brooks standing alone by the exit. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Ava lowered her gaze respectfully. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Margaret Ellis nodded once. "You are still here." Principal Cooper blinked. "You know Miss Brooks?" Richard's smile returned. "She is simply one of our scholarship students." Margaret looked at him for the first time. "Is that what you believe?" The room tightened again. Richard folded his arms. I believe she interrupted an awards ceremony with accusations she cannot prove. Margaret glanced toward the giant screen where the restored files still glowed in cold blue light. It appears she already has. Ethan shifted uneasily beside the trophy. Sweat slipped down the side of his neck. He quietly set the heavy award on the table as though it had suddenly become impossible to hold. Richard noticed but refused to look concerned. File histories can be misunderstood. Margaret slowly opened her briefcase. The old leather creaked softly in the silence. Inside rested several neatly organized folders, each marked with the school's official seal. She withdrew one and handed it directly to Principal Cooper. Open page 12. The principal obeyed. His fingers trembled slightly as paper rustled beneath the stage lights. His eyes widened almost immediately. This? He whispered. This was submitted months ago. Richard frowned. What exactly am I looking at? Cooper looked up. The independent research verification. Another wave of whispers swept across the auditorium. Margaret spoke calmly. Every finalist's work was reviewed anonymously by outside scientists before today's ceremony. Richard's expression hardened. Then there is no issue. Margaret remained perfectly still. Your son's project received the lowest originality score in the entire competition. Silence crashed through the room. Ethan closed his eyes. Richard laughed once, but this time nobody joined him. Impossible. Margaret reached into the folder again and removed another document. The glossy page reflected the bright stage lights like polished steel. The highest score belonged to Ava Brooks. Every student turned toward Ava. She looked overwhelmed rather than victorious, clutching the worn blue folder against her chest as though it were the only thing keeping her steady. Richard's voice became colder. Then why was my son standing on this stage? Principal Cooper slowly lowered his eyes. No answer came. Margaret answered for him. Because someone instructed the committee to replace the winning presentation 48 hours before the ceremony. Hundreds of faces shifted from Ava to Richard. A phone vibrated loudly in the front row before its owner hurriedly silenced it. Ethan's breathing became audible now, shallow and uneven. Richard stared at Principal Cooper. You are accusing me? Not yet, Margaret replied. I am following evidence. Ava finally spoke. Please, this was never about taking anyone down. Richard snapped toward her. Do not pretend to be noble. She met his eyes without flinching for the first time all afternoon. I only wanted my work to stay mine. Her quiet words landed harder than any raised voice. Even the students who had doubted her lowered their phones. Richard opened his mouth to answer, but before a single word escaped, the auditorium speakers crackled alive with sharp electronic static. The control booth lights flashed red. Then an unfamiliar recording began to play, and the very first voice everyone heard belonged to Richard Ashford himself. Richard Ashford's voice filled the auditorium before anyone could stop the recording. Move Ava Brooks off the finalist list. My son walks across that stage tomorrow. The words echoed through the speakers with perfect clarity. Every phone in the room tilted toward him at once. Tiny recording lights blinked red across the audience like scattered embers. Richard's face strained of color. Turn it off, he shouted. The technology coordinator slammed keys across the console, but the audio continued. Nobody questions where the funding comes from, Richard's recorded voice said. Handle it quietly. A sharp gasp swept through the rows of students. Principal Cooper slowly lowered the folder in his hands. The cold light from the projector reflected across his glasses, hiding his eyes completely. Ethan stared at the floor, his shoulders sinking another inch. Richard pointed toward the control booth. This recording is fabricated. Someone is trying to destroy my family. Margaret Ellis never moved. The file came from the school's secured archive. Richard laughed bitterly. Then your archive has been compromised. Before anyone answered, Ava quietly stepped away from the exit and walked back toward the stage. Her sneakers barely made a sound against the polished wood, yet every eye followed her. She did not look at Richard. She looked at the giant screen where the audio waveform still glowed in bright blue lines. Something about it caught her attention. She narrowed her eyes. "Pause it," she said. Nobody reacted. "Pause it at exactly 12 seconds. The technology coordinator hesitated before pressing the space bar. The frozen waveform stretched across the display. Ava stepped closer, studying the image as though she had forgotten the crowd behind her. Richard shook his head in disbelief. "Enough. She is a student, not a forensic expert." Ava ignored him. "Play the next 3 seconds." The recording resumed. Beneath Richard's voice, another sound emerged. Faint. Metallic. Rhythmic. Almost invisible beneath the conversation. Ava closed her eyes for a moment. The room became so quiet that the projector fans sounded like distant wind. "There," she whispered. "Stop." The waveform froze again. Principal Cooper frowned. "What did you hear?" Ava pointed toward the screen. "Not what he said. Where he said it." Richard scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Ava turned toward him calmly. "Your office has carpet." Richard blinked. "What?" "Your office has thick carpet. Every time someone walks in, there is almost no echo." She pointed at the waveform again. "This recording has concrete reflections." The technology coordinator leaned closer to his monitor. His fingers raced across the keyboard. Spectral analysis filled the screen. Blue bars shifted into orange and red. He swallowed hard. She might be right." Murmurs exploded through the auditorium. Margaret folded her arms without taking her eyes off Ava. "Go on." Ava inhaled slowly. "Listen to the background." The recording played once more. This time everyone heard it. A low mechanical vibration. A slow rolling hum. Then a sharp metallic clank repeating every few seconds. Ava spoke softly. "That is not an office air conditioner." Richard's confidence cracked again. "You are guessing." Ava shook her head. "No." Her voice stayed steady. "That sound comes from an industrial freight elevator. We hear it every afternoon behind the engineering workshop." Principal Cooper looked sharply toward the science wing visible through the auditorium windows. The engineering building sat less than 100 yards away. Richard's breathing grew uneven. "This proves nothing." The technology coordinator suddenly looked up from his screen. His face had turned completely pale. "Actually," his voice almost disappeared beneath the whispers. "The recording metadata says it was captured at exactly 4:23 in the afternoon, inside Engineering Lab 3. Ethan slowly covered his face with both hands. Richard stared at his son, then back at the screen, then toward the hallway leading to the engineering building. Before anyone could move, every light inside the auditorium flickered twice. A loud electronic buzz echoed through the ceiling. The giant screen switched by itself from the audio file to a live security camera feed. Engineering Lab 3 was empty, except for a single locked metal cabinet that had just begun to open on its own. The security camera feed trembled for a split second, then sharpened into perfect focus. The steel cabinet inside Engineering Lab 3 creaked open inch by inch, its polished doors reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. Every breath inside the auditorium seemed to stop at once. Hundreds of phones remained raised, their tiny recording lights blinking across the crowd. Somewhere in the back row, a chair scraped softly against the floor before falling silent again. Richard Ashford took one quick step toward the stage. "Cut that feed now!" His voice cracked with urgency rather than authority for the first time all afternoon. The technology coordinator hammered at the keyboard, but every command flashed the same response in bright red letters. "Access denied?" Principal Cooper slowly removed his glasses, staring at the screen without blinking. Margaret Ellis tightened her grip on her cane. Even she looked unsettled. Ava never took her eyes off the cabinet. Her breathing slowed instead of quickening. She noticed something no one else seemed to see. A faint amber light blinking beneath the cabinet shelf. Once every 2 seconds. Perfectly steady. "Wait," she whispered. Nobody heard her. Richard pointed toward the hallway. Someone get into that lab immediately. 2 campus security officers hurried toward the exit, their polished shoes striking the concrete corridor outside with sharp echoes that faded into the distance. Ethan remained frozen beside the abandoned trophy table. Sweat rolled from his temple onto the collar of his white shirt. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He looked toward his father, silently begging for an answer that never came. The cabinet door reached its final position. Inside sat a black external hard drive connected to a small battery pack. Its tiny cooling fan emitted a soft mechanical buzz that the auditorium microphones somehow captured with startling clarity. Ava stepped closer to the screen. "Do not touch it," she said quietly. Richard spun toward her. "Enough. You have caused enough damage already." Ava met his glare without raising her voice. "If anyone opens that drive the wrong way, every backup file could disappear." Several teachers exchanged confused looks. Richard laughed bitterly. "Now she is an information security expert too?" Ava ignored him. "Look at the blinking light." The technology coordinator leaned closer to his monitor. His eyes widened. "She is right." Richard slammed his hand against the edge of the podium. The sharp crack echoed across the silent room. "Stop listening to her." Nobody moved. The coordinator swallowed hard. "That indicator means the drive is actively sinking." A wave of whispers swept through the audience again. Investors seated along the front row exchanged uneasy glances. One quietly lowered his event program and reached for his phone instead. Another removed his conference badge altogether. Richard noticed every movement. His face tightened. "This is a circus," Margaret answered calmly. "No. This is accountability." At that exact moment, the first security officer appeared on the live camera, jogging into Engineering Lab 3. His flashlight beam swept across the concrete floor, reflecting off scattered metal tools and unfinished robotics equipment. The room hummed with electrical transformers mounted high against the wall. Heat shimmered faintly above a row of testing machines. The officer reached toward the cabinet. "Do not!" Ava shouted so suddenly that the entire auditorium jumped. The officer froze with his hand inches away from the drive. Principal Cooper turned toward her. "Why?" Ava pointed at the lower corner of the screen where a tiny status bar continued climbing. 94%. 95. 96. "It is still transferring," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If he disconnects it now." Nobody finished the sentence. Even Richard stared silently at the screen. The status bar reached 99%. The cooling fan inside the drive spun faster, its high-pitched whine filling the speakers. Then every phone in the auditorium vibrated at exactly the same instant. Students looked down in confusion. Teachers did the same. Principal Cooper's eyes dropped to his own screen. Richard slowly pulled out his phone. A new email had just arrived. Sender, Anonymous Archive. Subject line, everything they tried to hide. Attached files, 217. The vibration stopped as suddenly as it had begun. One by one, phone screens dimmed, but nobody put them away. The auditorium no longer buzzed with whispers. It breathed. Slow. Heavy. Uneasy. The cold projector light painted pale reflections across the polished stage, while the live feed from Engineering Lab 3 remained frozen on the humming black drive. Even the cooling fan had settled into a faint, steady whisper. Richard Ashford stared at the unopened email on his phone as though touching it might detonate everything he had spent 30 years building. His thumb hovered above the screen but refused to move. Around him, investors stood perfectly still. A few loosened their ties. Others quietly slipped their event badges into their pockets. Nobody wanted to be the first person seen standing beside a collapsing empire. Ethan looked smaller than he had all afternoon. His shoulders sagged beneath the bright stage lights, and he avoided every pair of eyes in the room. The gold trophy beside him no longer looked like a prize. It looked abandoned. Principal Cooper slowly lowered his phone without opening the attachment. He turned toward Margaret Ellis. Should we review the files? Margaret answered without taking her eyes off Ava. Not yet. Richard finally looked up. Why wait? Margaret's voice remained calm. Because panic destroys evidence. The sentence landed softly, but it carried through the silent room more powerfully than any shout. Ava remained near the front row, the worn blue folder still resting against her chest. She had not opened the anonymous email either. She simply watched the frozen security feed with quiet concentration. Something about the image still bothered her. The engineering lab looked wrong. Not dangerous. Incomplete. Her eyes drifted toward the corner of the screen where rows of robotic prototypes sat beneath stainless steel workbenches. Reflections from the fluorescent lights shimmered across the brushed metal like ripples on cold water. Then she noticed it. Zoom in, she said gently. The technology coordinator looked toward Richard, then toward Margaret, before obeying. The camera magnified the image. Every pixel sharpened. Every bolt, cable, and tool became clearer. Ava stepped closer. A little farther. Another click. Another zoom. Students leaned forward in complete silence. Richard folded his arms again, but this time it looked less like confidence and more like protection. What exactly are we looking for? Ava did not answer immediately. She studied the reflection in one of the stainless steel cabinets beside the hard drive. It was faint. Distorted. Almost invisible. There, she whispered. The coordinator froze the frame. Principal Cooper narrowed his eyes. I do not see anything. Ava raised one finger toward the reflection. Someone closed the cabinet. Richard frowned. We all watched it open. Yes, Ava replied softly. But nobody watched it close. The room fell silent again. The reflection clearly showed the cabinet door nearly shut. Yet the live image still displayed it wide open. The technology coordinator stared at his monitor. His fingers began moving rapidly across the keyboard. Lines of system logs filled the screen. His breathing quickened. This is impossible. Margaret took one careful step forward. Explain. He swallowed hard. The security feed stopped updating almost 4 minutes ago. A ripple of disbelief spread through the audience. Richard slowly lowered his phone. So what are we looking at? A recording, the coordinator answered. Not a live feed. Every face turned back toward the giant screen. Ava never looked surprised. She only closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though the realization confirmed something she had already feared. Richard stared at her. For the first time since the ceremony began, there was no anger in his expression. Only uncertainty. You knew? Ava shook her head. I hoped I was wrong. The engineering building beyond the auditorium windows stood perfectly still beneath the fading afternoon light. Then, far across campus, a single emergency beacon suddenly began flashing on the roof. Slow. Red. Silent. Every head turned toward the window. At that exact moment, Principal Cooper's phone rang. He looked at the caller identification, and the color drained from his face. It was the engineering lab. The call had been placed 30 seconds ago. Principal Cooper stared at the ringing phone as though it weighed 100 pounds. The entire auditorium watched without breathing. The red emergency beacon outside continued flashing across the engineering building, its crimson glow reflecting against the windows like a distant heartbeat. Finally, Cooper answered and pressed the call onto speaker. Static crackled first. Then a frightened voice filled the room. Sir, nobody is inside Lab 3. A ripple of disbelief swept through the audience. Cooper frowned. What do you mean nobody is inside? We have a live camera feed. You do not understand, the officer replied, his breathing uneven. The cabinet is closed. The room is empty. The monitor in here has been disconnected for at least an hour. Every eye snapped toward the giant screen. The cabinet on the display still stood wide open. Richard Ashford slowly lowered his head, his confidence dissolving one silent second at a time. Ava took one careful step toward the stage. Her shoes barely whispered across the polished floor. She never looked triumphant. She looked concerned. "Switch cameras," she said quietly. The technology coordinator obeyed immediately. Camera 2. Black screen. Camera 4. Static. Camera 6. Empty hallway. Camera 8. Engineering Lab 3 appeared again, but this time the image was completely different. The cabinet was shut. The hard drive was gone. A collective gasp rolled through the auditorium. Students instinctively looked at one another, then back toward Ava. Richard blinked repeatedly as if refusing to trust his own eyes. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice stripped of every trace of arrogance. Ava answered without looking at him. "Because live reflections change." She pointed toward the frozen recording still displayed in the corner of the system archive. "The sunlight never moved." The technology coordinator froze. His fingers stopped above the keyboard. "She is right." He quickly opened the timestamp logs. Someone replaced the live feed with a recorded loop exactly 4 minutes before the ceremony. Margaret Ellis slowly closed her eyes. Premeditated. Richard's breathing grew heavier. Investors who had remained silent all afternoon now exchanged unmistakable looks. One quietly stood and walked away from the front row. Then another. Then a third. Nobody wanted to remain beside a scandal that was unraveling in real time. Ethan finally looked toward Ava. His eyes were red, his voice barely audible. "I did not build that project." Silence swallowed the confession. Richard turned toward his son so slowly it almost hurt to watch. "What did you say?" Ethan swallowed hard. I let people tell me everything would be handled." His hands shook uncontrollably. "They said nobody would ever know." Richard closed his eyes. The words hit harder than any accusation. The applause he had imagined all morning had become the sound of his own reputation collapsing one sentence at a time. Principal Cooper stared at the stage, unable to speak. Margaret looked toward Ava with quiet admiration. "You kept trying to stop this, did you not?" Ava nodded faintly. 3 times. Cooper looked confused. 3? Ava slowly reached into the blue folder she had protected all afternoon. Inside were 3 unopened envelopes, each stamped received by the school office on different dates. "I reported missing files." She placed them gently on the podium. Nobody answered. Cooper picked up the first envelope with trembling hands. The date was 6 months earlier. The second. 3 months. The third. Last week. Every submission carried Ava's signature. Every one had been officially received. None had ever been investigated. A heavy silence settled across the auditorium. Students who had doubted her lowered their phones. Teachers avoided her eyes. Richard looked at the envelopes, then at the young woman he had publicly ordered out only minutes before. His lips parted, but no words came. Then the technology coordinator suddenly stiffened in his chair. His monitor flashed bright red again. He looked up, pale as paper. "Someone just logged into the district servers." Every head turned toward the giant screen as a new message slowly typed itself across the display. This story was never only about one student. The words on the giant screen refused to disappear. This story was never only about one student. No one spoke. The only sounds left inside the auditorium were the quiet vibration of the projector cooling fan and the soft buzz of dozens of phones still recording a moment none of them had expected to witness. The fluorescent lights reflected across tear-filled eyes instead of polished trophies. Richard Ashford stood motionless beneath the stage lights. The man who had filled every room with certainty now looked strangely small, his tailored suit unable to hide the weight settling across his shoulders. He looked toward Ava Brooks, but this time there was no anger, no authority, no command. Only a question he did not know how to ask. Principal Cooper slowly opened the newly released files on the main screen. Each document appeared with the same unmistakable pattern. Student complaints. Missing research. Anonymous reports. Scholarship recommendations quietly altered after private meetings. Dates stretched back years. Different names. Different students. One after another. The room grew heavier with every page. Teachers lowered their heads. Several members of the school board exchanged pale, silent glances. An investor quietly closed his leather portfolio and walked toward the exit without saying a word. Then another followed. Nobody wanted to pretend anymore that this was simply a misunderstanding. Margaret Ellis looked across the audience before turning to Ava. You were never fighting for yourself alone, were you? Ava looked down at the worn blue folder resting against her chest. Its edges were frayed from months of being carried through hallways where almost nobody had noticed her. No, ma'am, she answered softly. I just wanted someone to read what we kept sending. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, yet somehow every person in the auditorium heard every word. A teacher in the second row slowly removed her faculty badge and stared at it for several seconds before slipping it into her pocket. Another quietly wiped away tears she had been trying to hide all afternoon. Ethan stepped away from the abandoned trophy table. The polished award reflected the cold lights above, untouched and forgotten. He stopped a few feet from Ava, unable to meet her eyes at first. I should have stopped it, he said quietly. The first time. Ava looked at him with calm, tired eyes. She did not smile. She did not accuse him. She simply nodded once. That silent forgiveness hurt him more than any anger could have. Richard watched the exchange from across the stage. His breathing had become slow and uneven. He remembered every assumption he had made within seconds of seeing Ava stand up. He had never asked a single question. He had only looked at the color of her skin, the worn backpack on her shoulder, the scholarship beside her name, and decided he already knew the truth. The realization settled over him like winter. He took one careful step forward. Then another. Hundreds of cameras followed every movement. He stopped directly in front of Ava. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. The silence itself became the loudest sound in the room. Finally Richard lowered his head. Not halfway. Completely. Miss Brooks. His voice trembled for the first time anyone could remember. I was wrong. No applause came. No cheers. The words were too heavy for celebration. Ava looked at the billionaire standing before her, then slowly extended the blue folder into his hands. Richard accepted it with both hands instead of one. Inside were months of research, unanswered letters, handwritten notes, and every rejected attempt to tell the truth without embarrassing anyone. He turned the first page. A small sticky note rested at the top in neat handwriting. If someone would only listen, none of this has to happen. Richard closed his eyes. Around them, the audience no longer looked at Ava as the girl who had interrupted an awards ceremony. They looked at her as the one person who had refused to let honesty disappear, even after everyone else had looked away. Then the auditorium doors opened quietly. A district investigator stepped inside carrying a sealed evidence case. He walked directly toward the stage, stopped beside Margaret Ellis, and spoke only one sentence. The superintendent is on his way, and he asked one question before he arrives. Every eye turned toward him. The investigator looked at Ava. Will Miss Brooks be willing to tell the whole story? The investigator's question lingered in the air long after the last syllable faded. Nobody looked away from Ava Brooks. Hundreds of phones, which had been raised all afternoon, slowly lowered one by one until the auditorium settled into a silence so complete that the faint hum of the stage lights became the loudest sound in the room. The projector fan finally spun down, leaving only a soft mechanical whisper before it, too, fell quiet. Ava looked toward the sealed evidence case, then at the faces filling the auditorium. Some carried regret. Others carried shame. Many simply looked exhausted from watching everything they believed collapse in a single afternoon. She gently adjusted the worn strap of her backpack, the same backpack people had silently judged the moment she walked through the doors. Yes, she answered. I will tell the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. There was no victory in her voice. Only peace. The district investigator nodded once. That is all we need. Richard Ashford remained standing where he was, the blue folder still resting carefully in both hands. Its pages no longer looked like paperwork. They looked like months of ignored courage. He slowly turned the first handwritten note again, tracing the edge without realizing it. The ink had faded slightly where careful fingers had carried it from office to office. He remembered pointing toward the exit before asking a single question. He remembered assuming that power spoke louder than character. He looked up at Ava. "I cannot undo today," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "No." A long pause followed. "But tomorrow does not have to look the same." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment, accepting the truth instead of defending himself against it. Across the front rows, investors quietly collected their belongings without speaking. Teachers approached one another in silence. Principal Cooper removed the winner's certificate bearing Ethan's name and carefully placed it back inside its presentation case. Then he reached beneath the podium and unfolded another certificate that had never been presented. The paper was crisp, untouched. He walked toward Ava himself. No music played. No applause interrupted the moment. He simply stopped in front of her and held it out with both hands. "This belongs to you." Ava accepted it gently, almost cautiously, as though the paper mattered less than what had finally changed around it. Ethan stepped forward next. His eyes were still red. He looked at the certificate, then at Ava. "Congratulations," he whispered. This time, the word carried no competition. Only honesty. Ava gave a small nod. "Thank you." Margaret Ellis smiled faintly, the first smile anyone had seen from her all day. "Some buildings are held up by money," she said softly. "Schools are held up by people like her." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Outside, the late afternoon sun slipped beneath a layer of gray clouds, sending warm golden light through the auditorium windows. It stretched across the polished floor until it reached Ava's shoes, then climbed slowly over the blue folder and the certificate in her hands. Richard noticed that light before he noticed anything else. For the first time in years, his name carved into the science building outside felt far less important than the young woman quietly walking toward the exit with nothing but a backpack, a folder, and her dignity intact. The crowd did not part because someone ordered them to. They stepped aside on their own. One student after another. Then teachers. Then board members. A clear path opened through the center of the auditorium. Ava walked forward at the same calm pace she had carried all afternoon. Her footsteps echoed softly across the hardwood, no longer sounding lonely. Just before she reached the doors, she paused for a single heartbeat and looked back. Richard was still standing exactly where he had told her to leave. Only now, it was he who could not take a single step. Ava offered one quiet, respectful nod, then pushed open the doors. Cool evening air drifted inside as golden light spilled across the empty stage. The doors closed gently behind her. No one rushed to break the silence. Because in that final stillness, everyone understood the same simple truth. Respect had entered the room wearing a worn backpack, and it was the only thing that walked out undefeated.